Hi, my name is Robert Schmad, reporting for the Washington Examiner. I'm joined here with former Ambassador Jim Gilmore, and we're going to discuss the U.S. aid cuts and how those could potentially be repurposed to advance America's interests abroad. What are two or three, specific programs or maybe even broader areas that these since canceled funds can be repurposed for to advance America's interests in that way?
Uh, my view, and again, I don't advise the president, but if I were advising the president, I would remind him that we are in a global war right now, and that global war doesn't have to be just a shooting war. I learned about the concept of hybrid warfare, which is very much what China and Russia do. And in the hybrid warfare, you focus all of the elements of a country's national power against an adversary. And that means propaganda, messaging, economics, sanctions, and military. All of those elements can be focused against an opponent. In our case, the USAID helps us to gain the support of people around the world if, for example, we're doing things regarding disease, programs, and other programs like that that can be directly tied to the American taxpayer so that people in foreign countries are aware that they're actually getting the benefit of the American taxpayer. And in that case, I think we do play an important role in this hybrid warfare with that. And I think we've seen examples of that right now, and I think that ought to be continued, but only after that test of whether it serves the American national interest.
On the topic of Russian and Chinese influence, you've written before that in during that period of American foreign aid being frozen, both countries pounced to expand their respective spheres of influence. How damaging do you think that was? And in the short term, what can be done to mend some of what has been affected?
It's ongoing right now. The Chinese and the Russians understand this. The Chinese, of course, are more equipped to do this kind of work than the Russians are. But both countries are reaching out at this point, particularly into African countries and other border countries around the world, in order to try to project their influence. And they do that through their aid programs. Once again, I'm not against the aid program. I simply believe that the test has to be strictly in the American national interest, and I think that's consistent with the president's philosophy on this. Now, I will say, I'll add a couple of things. I will say this. I believe an example, though, of what we really need to be doing is, for example, the Voice of America. Now, the president, I think, is diminishing that and I think that's not a good idea. My experience from the Cold War, that where I was a soldier, and then the diplomacy experience that I've had, is that the Chinese and the Russians are particularly trying to isolate their populations from the truth. Voice of America has always traditionally broadcast that truth, and that's once again part of our messaging program, and I think that ought to continue. But to your point, China has already said that the USAID, that the Voice of America, they're glad that it's being shut down because they described it as like a dirty rag. On the USAID program, the Russians basically have described it as a machine for interfering in international affairs. Of course, they're doing that, right? They're
Mhm.
not only doing it through soft power, they're doing it through military war. So this just defines the many ways that we're engaged in this conflict.
A similar question, along a similar vein to Voice of America, the president faced some criticism for canceling congressionally appropriated funds to the National Endowment for Democracy, which does a lot of the sort of soft power work countering Chinese influence abroad. Can you speak to whether or not you think that maybe was a mistake, cutting off that funding to the National Endowment for Democracy?
I would want to examine the programs that the president disapproved of and unfinanced before I could answer that question. But I would apply the same rule, and that is to make sure that programs like the Institute for Democracy are actually pursuing the American national interest. Now, I also believe that encouraging democracy is pursuing the American national interest. In fact, I would say that my definition is that that is putting America first. And again, more largely, my view is that in this global conflict that we're in, the United States is going to need allies. And putting America first does not mean America alone. And as a matter of fact, working with our allies and bringing them to our side is putting America first, in my view. One more point. There's discussion right now about reducing significantly the Department of State. Again, I would not fundamentally disapprove of anything that the president's trying to do to save money and to make things more efficient. I just simply believe that you have to be careful to make sure that any functions that are dismissed are not essential to the American national interest. And so far, it's mostly publicly been described as certain percentage of reduction here, certain percentage of reduction there. I believe that has to be connected to function, particularly with respect to the Department of State.
You sort of touched on this in your prior answer, but I'm curious, as a first point, are you worried about the growing contingent in the Republican Party that has a more isolationist bend? And if so, what would your elevator pitch to them be to bring them back onto the side of America having a prominent role in the global community?
Historically, America has had this element appear from time to time. It's never been a happy ending. Before we had isolationism before World War II, and that just allowed things to spin completely out of control until Pearl Harbor. Once again, I think isolationism and drawing a power, national, world, global power like the United States back inwards is a recipe for world war. And I don't believe we should be doing that. And also there's a duality to American policy. One is the realist policy to make sure that we're conducting ourselves in the American national interest strictly. But there's also a duality. Americans also believe in Western values that we've always argued on behalf of. And frankly, I believe the people of the world want to come to Western values led by the United States. I believe that that would include, by the way, in the long run, the populations of China and Russia. These are people that believe in human values, but some of them live under terrible tyrannies right now, and they can't do anything about it. But meanwhile, there are populations around the world that may be subjected to the siren call of tyranny, and they will respond favorably to the United States if the United States continues to lead. I am opposed to the reemergence of isolationism in the Republican Party.
I'm Robert Schmad, reporting for the Washington Examiner. You can read more of our news coverage at thewashingtonexaminer.com.